Continuing our studies in the book of Hebrews, and we come this time to the first 6 verses of chapter 8. And we're coming to part 2, the superior ministry of Jesus. Part 2 of this 3-part mini-series within a series in the book of Hebrews. If you're old enough, would you cast your mind back 20 years? I want you to make a rough estimate. In your own mind, put a percentage figure on how much has changed in your life in those 20 years. What percentage of things in your life has changed? Would you say 20%? Would you say 50%? Maybe you'd even say 90%. Now, it's hard to quantify numerically that kind of change. Think of it in a different way then. How many things in your life have not changed in the past 20 years? How many things are exactly the same today as they were 20 years ago? For me, I can't really think of many things that have remained unchanged. 20 years ago, I was a 17-year-old. I had just met Charlie. In that 20 years, in those 2 decades in between, she has become my wife, and we have 2 children. We have built a house together, and now we're all set to leave that house and move 2 hours away. Nothing, it seems, remains constant. Everything is in flux. But for the one who is resting in Jesus, there is one constant. Jesus is in heaven for us. That is the thing that remains unchanged. Jesus is in heaven for us. 2 weeks ago we began considering this passage, the passage that runs from verse 26 of chapter 7 right through to the end of chapter 8. And as I stated at that time, this passage speaks to us explicitly about the work that Jesus Christ has done for us and the work that he is now doing for us. And we can sum up the thought of this entire passage with this statement: Jesus is the great high priest that we need, since, having offered a superior sacrifice, he serves in a superior tabernacle, mediating a superior covenant. And so last time we thought about the superior sacrifice of Jesus, how he is as the promised great high priest, was the only one able to offer himself as the substitute for sinners, since he alone was sinless, perfect, having no need to atone for his own sins. This morning, I want us to look at the second aspect of his work that the writer brings up in this passage, and that is his service for us, his ministry for us in the superior tabernacle. What the writer wants us to see is that Jesus continually ministers to us and for us in heaven as the great high priest that we need. These believers to whom this letter was written, they were tempted to go back to Judaism. One of the huge draws for them was the temple worship. And one of the objections that they would have faced as they were leaving the temple, they would have faced the accusation, the objection: you Christians, you claim that Jesus Christ is your great high priest, but where is he? You can't see him. You can't see his priestly activity for you. We have the temple in Jerusalem. We see our high priest. What the writer is pointing out in these first 6 verses of chapter 8 is that Jesus' ministry is superior to the ministry of the high priest and the priests in the temple in Jerusalem. His ministry is superior since he ministers for us as the true high priest in the true tabernacle. His ministry is superior because he is in heaven for us, and that will never change. I said last time that we're considering this whole passage, that what we're considering in this whole passage is really one sermon in 3 parts. So last week we had point number 1. This week we have point number 2. Jesus continually serves in a superior tabernacle. Jesus continually serves in a superior tabernacle. Following on from the previous section, the writer, as he speaks about the work of Christ, he goes on now. He doesn't just simply leave it at the point of sacrifice. Jesus' work didn't end at the point of sacrifice. Yes, redemption was accomplished with Jesus' offering up of himself. At the cross, it was finished. But that redemption must be applied. Those sons for whom the Son has died must be brought to glory. And so the high priestly ministry of Jesus continues. As the great high priest, his ministry of sacrifice is complete. It was once for all. It was never to be repeated. But still, as our great high priest, his ministry of intercession continues. And it continues precisely because he is the great high priest that we need. Now, even though the verses that we're considering, even though they are at the beginning of a new chapter, the writer isn't starting a new train of thought, but he's continuing on the same train of thought that he has already begun. And so in verse 1 he says, the main point in what we are saying is this. Let me recap, he says, with a basic statement, a summary statement. And what is the summary statement? We have such a high priest as this. He said in verse 26 of chapter 7, we need such a high priest. And then he proceeded on to describe the high priest that we need, one who can provide himself as the substitutionary sacrifice. But now he says, we do indeed have that exact kind of high priest. And that is the main thrust of his argument. The high priest that we need is exactly the high priest that we have. But how do we know that he is the high priest that we need? Well, he goes on to point out two facts that drive home his point. Because Jesus is such a high priest, because he is the high priest that we need, then he is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, and he is a minister in the holy places, in the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. Now, last Sabbath evening I spoke about trigger statements in Scripture. Statements that would have made the original audience think of other places in Scripture. And here, in these two verses of chapter 8, the first two verses of chapter 8, the writer is using a trigger statement. And he's making his audience think of the psalm that he has actually been dwelling on for some time, Psalm 110. And that psalm begins with the Lord, Yahweh, the God of Israel, saying to David's Lord, sit at my right hand. And then in verse 4 of that psalm, he gives the word of the oath, you are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. And if this one in Psalm 110, if he is an eternal priest, then he must minister in an eternal tabernacle. And so Psalm 110, it has those two features in it that appear at the start of chapter 8 here. That psalm is about one who is seated at God's right hand, but one who is a great high priest who ministers in the true and eternal tabernacle or temple. Jesus, the writer is pointing out, is the great high priest that we need because he is the fulfillment of Psalm 110. He is the one who sits at God's right hand. He is the one who ministers as the eternal high priest. But we need to ask the question, where is the writer speaking about in the first two verses in chapter 8? Where is this place that Jesus is seated, and where does he minister? Are they two different places, or are they one place? Well, when it comes to the location of the throne of majesty, that's pretty straightforward. As the writer says, seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven. But then, when we think of the location of the holies and the true tent that the writer goes on to speak about, that must be in the same place. That must be in heaven as well. Because the one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, at the very same time that he is seated there, he is the minister in the holy places and the true tent. So both the right hand of the throne of the majesty and the holies and the true tent, these are phrases describing or pointing to heaven itself. And so the writer is stating that the very crux of the matter in all that he has been saying is this. We know Jesus is the high priest that we need because at this very moment he is ministering for us in heaven itself. That is the point that the writer is driving at. But then, as he so often does, it seems as if he imagines a question coming from his audience. And that question, we've touched on it before, but we're going to consider it in more depth as it has come up in this text. Why? Why is Jesus in heaven as our high priest? Why can't he be on earth? Why can't we see him ministering for us? Why can't we go to a geographical location on earth and see Jesus ministering for us as our great high priest? Why does he have to be in heaven? And so to answer this question, the writer launches into another comparison in verses 3 to 5. Another comparison of Jesus' priesthood as compared with the priesthood of Aaron and his sons. And in these verses, he explains why Jesus isn't simply another high priest who ministers on earth. He explains why Jesus is not just another high priest who ministers in the tabernacle or the temple in Jerusalem. And he explains to us the reality of what those priests on earth are actually doing. But he takes us step by step. And so in verse 3, he begins his comparison by telling us what the job of every high priest was. What was the duty of every high priest? Every high priest, he says, is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. That was the purpose that every high priest had. It was to offer gifts and sacrifices. And so, if that is the purpose of every high priest, then it follows that this high priest, the high priest that we need, must also have something to offer. Now, he's not so much here focusing on the offering that Jesus brings, but the fact that he has the same purpose as every other high priest. If every other high priest was appointed to bring offerings, then Jesus, in that sense, could be no different. And if he was appointed to bring sacrifices and offerings and gifts, then just like the other high priests, he must have a place to bring them to. And then in verse 4 and 5, he highlights that vital difference, the place where the priests minister. He says in verse 4, "Now if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all." It's as if he's saying at the beginning of verse 4, imagine if Jesus were to attempt to fulfill his priestly role on earth. It simply couldn't be done. Why not? Well, he goes on, "Since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law." He's pointing out the plain fact that Jesus was legally disqualified from being a priest in the temple. Jesus was legally disqualified from being a priest in the temple. As we saw previously, the tabernacle and the temple system on earth was framed by law. And the laws covered not only what was to be offered, but who was to offer these gifts and these offerings. The priests who offered in the tabernacle and the temple, they must be descended from Aaron. But Jesus did not fulfill that legal requirement. And that's why the writer here says in verse 4 that if Jesus were on earth, he wouldn't be a priest at all, because he was descended from the tribe of Judah, not the tribe of Levi, the tribe from which Aaron came. Well, then the objection could be made, could it not? Isn't that a limitation to Jesus' ministry as high priest for his people? If he couldn't fulfill his ministry on earth in the temple, would his ministry in heaven be any better? The writer answers this objection in verse 5 by showing us that the ministry of the high priest on earth was actually the ministry with the limitation. And it had a limitation because their ministry took place in a copy and a shadow of the heavenly things. The tabernacle or the temple on earth was simply a shadow and a copy of the true tabernacle in heaven. And he goes on to explain. When Moses was on Mount Sinai, he was shown a vision. He was shown a pattern by which he was supposed to make the temple after. He was supposed to make the tabernacle after this pattern that he saw in the mountain. He was shown a vision of heaven. He was shown the place where the great high priest, Jesus the Son, would exercise his ministry of intercession for his people. And Moses was told to replicate that vision on earth. The tabernacle was never the reality. The tabernacle was a picture of heaven itself. It might be useful at this point to explore a little more about what the writer is saying here, about the connection between heaven and the tabernacle on earth. He has made a couple of statements in this section about heaven being the true tent or the true tabernacle, and the tabernacle on earth being a copy and a shadow of the heavenly things. We can often overlook the fact that the entirety of the structure of the tabernacle and later on the temple, they were actually pointing to something else. They were designed to replicate the heavens and the earth. We saw that earlier when we sang from Psalm 78. The writer there in verse 69, as we have it in the ESV, says, he built his sanctuary like the high heavens, like the earth which was founded forever. The whole tabernacle structure had three distinct areas. First of all, there was the courtyard. And then there was, within the tent itself, there were two sections. There was the holy place. And then behind the holy place, there was the Holy of Holies. The courtyard around the tent, it was open. It was open to the elements. But the holy place and the Holy of Holies, as I said, was under one tent. And in that structure, we are given a representation of all of created reality. The courtyard represents the earth. The holy place represents the visible heavens, where you have the sun, the moon, and the stars. And then the Holy of Holies represents the invisible heavens, that place that God created as his own dwelling place, the place where his glory is displayed in unapproachable light. The courtyard of the tabernacle, or the temple, that was the place where the sacrifices took place. And then, in the case of the sacrifice on the Day of Atonement, the blood of that sacrifice would then be carried by the high priest into the tent, right through the holy place and into the Holy of Holies itself. And then when the high priest sprinkled the blood in the Ark of the Covenant, which represented the throne of God, he would come out. What did all of that represent? Just as the sacrifice was killed in the courtyard of the tabernacle, so Christ offered himself as the great sacrifice for sin on earth. And then just as the high priest carried the sacrifice through the holy place right into the Holy of Holies, so Jesus, as our sacrifice, at the moment of his death, went as a disembodied soul right into the presence of God. Remember when he was about to breathe his last, he said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." His soul went right into the very presence of God itself. On a side note, you might have heard of this idea that Jesus took his own blood into heaven with him at the moment of his death. Is that biblical? It's not biblical. Jesus didn't have to carry his own blood into heaven. The blood in the sacrificial system was a symbol for the soul. As the dead body of Jesus hung on the cross, his soul went straight to his Father, thereby fulfilling the symbol of the blood being brought by the high priest into the Holy of Holies. But then, just as the high priest came back out of the Holy of Holies, right back into the courtyard where the people were standing waiting, so the soul of Jesus returned to earth and victoriously took again that body which he had laid down for his people in death. And he rose from the dead, body and soul reunited again together to live forever in the power of an indestructible life. Everything about the temple, everything about the tabernacle, the whole sacrificial system, how it all operated, it was to display to the people of Israel how man could approach God and how God would dwell with his people through the person and work of the great high priest who was promised. It was a teaching tool, if you like. But the writer here is stressing the fact that it was a replica. It was not the reality. It was a faint mirror image of reality. And those who served in it, the priests and the high priest, they couldn't deal with the people's sin. They could only show them what the gospel is in picture form. They were not actually bringing the people to God, or they were not actually bringing God to the people, but they were serving as reflectors of the great high priest in a reflection of heaven itself. But the reflection had its limitations. There was one thing that the temple and the priestly activity that went on in it, there was one thing that it couldn't show. It couldn't show what would happen when the promised great high priest would complete his great all-sufficient sacrifice for sin. What does verse 1 say of chapter 8 in Hebrews? It says that Jesus is now seated, and that he is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven. Go back into the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle. There was only one item of furniture. There was only one item in the Holy of Holies, and it was the Ark of the Covenant. And it had upon it a lid which was made of gold, and that lid was called the mercy seat. It was the item in the tabernacle which represented the throne of God in heaven. Imagine if a high priest had sat down on that seat. Imagine if a high priest had had the audacity to sit down on the item in the temple which represented God's throne. He couldn't have done it. He would have been struck dead immediately. That was reserved for the presence of God alone. The high priest could only come near that throne once a year with the blood of atonement sacrifice. And when he sprinkled the blood on that mercy seat, he turned and he left. And he didn't return until the next year. And he didn't return without blood. Sin was never fully dealt with. But Jesus, as our great high priest, after his resurrection, what did he do? He returned to heaven. He returned right into the true Holy of Holies, and he sat down on the throne of God at God's invitation, as we see in Psalm 110. This is astounding. He has gone where no priest has ever gone, into heaven itself, in exaltation. And he has done what no priest has ever done. He has sat down on God's throne in ultimate authority. And that is why the writer makes this statement in the first part of verse 6. Christ has obtained a more excellent ministry. By his own death, Jesus has forever cancelled the need for any more sacrifices. And by his resurrection and ascension, he has cancelled the need for any more temple on earth. The temple in Jerusalem will never, ever be rebuilt, because the great high priest is seated forever in the true temple, in heaven itself for his people. The replica temple with its replica priests is forever gone, because Jesus has obtained a more excellent ministry by his own death and resurrection. But there's something really interesting that we need to see about that word obtained. The way the writer uses that word, he uses it in such a way as to convey to us that this ministry that Jesus has obtained is a never-ending ministry. By his own death and resurrection, he has obtained this ministry and will never relinquish it. He is not only seated at God's right hand, he is seated there forever. That is a fact that will never change. He is not only ministering as our great high priest now, he will forever minister for us as our great high priest. The ministry of the earthly priests in the earthly tabernacle was an incomplete ministry in a state of continual change. But Jesus' ministry is complete and constant. Dear believer, all else might change in your life, but in the ministry of Jesus Christ as your great high priest, you have something that is changeless. On your worst day, Jesus is in heaven. He is seated at the right hand of God's majestic throne. He is exercising ultimate, unrivaled authority on your behalf, for your good. On your worst day, he is ministering for you, for your good, as your great high priest in the true tabernacle in heaven. As we close, I want you to think of 3 different ways that Jesus continually ministers for you. Jesus continually ministers for you when you sin. Later on in chapter 10, verse 21 to 22, the writer is going to say, the words, "Since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water." And then John, in his first epistle, chapter 2, verse 1, he says, "If anyone does sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous." We have a great high priest in heaven itself who guarantees our access into the very presence of God as we come for forgiveness of sins. Dear believer, each one of us sins day and daily. And sometimes we can fall into such sin which causes us so much shame. And we can easily fall prey to the thinking that surely God's done with us now. There's no way back. God will never entertain us in his presence again. But such thinking, brothers and sisters, hasn't reckoned with the more excellent ministry which Jesus exercises for his people right now in the presence of God for us. Because he is our unchanging, constant high priest in the presence of God, then we can draw near with a true heart, in full assurance of faith that our hearts have been sprinkled clean from an evil conscience. Since Jesus is there, in the very presence of God for us, there is no sin, brothers and sisters, there's no sin that can bar your access into God's presence. Because Jesus is there, there is full forgiveness. There is full reconciliation. There is full restoration. God welcomes you because his Son is your great high priest who is seated at his right hand on his very throne. Jesus continually ministers for you when you sin and when you suffer. Remember what the writer said in chapter 4, verses 14 to 16. Just turn for a moment, chapter 4, verses 14 and 16. He says, "Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need." So often as we suffer, we can become anxious. Does Jesus even care? Why is he bringing me through this trial? Is he testing me to reveal that I'm not the genuine article? Dear believer, when you suffer, Jesus is not testing you to show that you're a fraud. He's testing you so that you will draw closer to him. In your suffering, run to Jesus, your great high priest. He is seated at the right hand of the throne of the Majesty in heaven. Because he is there, it is a throne of grace. He is sitting there as your great high priest, and he is ready and he is eager to minister grace and mercy to you, to help you in your time of need. There is nothing that you can face which renders him weak and helpless. We are weak and helpless, but he is the strong one. He is the founder and the perfecter of faith. There is not one of those children given to him which he will not bring to glory. He continually ministers for you when you sin, when you suffer, and when you die. And here's where the passage that we read from John 14 comes in. Jesus said, "In my Father's house are many rooms." Why did he use that word? What was he talking about? Yes, he's talking about heaven, but he's being even more specific than that. He is speaking as our high priest, and he is talking about heaven in temple language. The temple in Jerusalem was different to the tabernacle in a number of ways, but it was most particularly in this way. Around the outside of the holy place and the Holy of Holies in the temple in Jerusalem that Solomon built, there were rooms, dwelling rooms. And those rooms were for the priests to live in as they came on duty in their rota in the temple. Jesus is saying that heaven itself is the true temple. But then he says this, "I go to prepare a place for you." Now he's not engaged in putting one stone on top of another in the material sense. He's not using building materials, but he is saying that as our great high priest, he is the one who will welcome us into the true tabernacle, the true temple. He says, "I will come again and take you to myself, that where I am, you will be also." The disciples would have spotted that he was using temple language, and they would have been astounded. No Israelite ever heard the high priest say words like that. No one could accompany the high priest into the Holy of Holies. The high priest himself could only be in there for as long as it took him to sprinkle blood on the mercy seat, and then he had to turn and get out. He couldn't dwell there, let alone bring anyone else in. But our great high priest, he assures us that his ministry for us isn't for this life only. No, one day, dear believer, you will join him in the true tabernacle, in that place where he himself has prepared for you. As we deal with all of the change in life, whether through sin or suffering or death, dear believer, look to your great high priest. He exercises a more excellent ministry for you to bring you right through life, right into glory itself, for all eternity. Amen. Let us stand as we come to God in prayer.